I'm going to probably spend the most amount of time on just summarizing the argument of the research project. I'll throw in a couple quick, larger conceptual implications. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on how the project came about. So I can take you into the making of the sausage and looking at what the sausage actually looks like. And a lot of it's not terribly pretty, but I think interesting and worthwhile. And then if I have time at the end to say a few words about the policy relevance.
Sorry, maybe just delete the standalone.
That's right. Otherwise, your shadow appears.
Oh, okay. And so we don't want to. Okay, sounds good. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the kind of a summary of the book. And I should start by saying the thing that got me interested in this originally was I was in Cambodia in March of 2010 when an old Cambodia scholar, a guy named Henri Loca, took myself and a couple friends, or one friend and a couple other hangers-on, to an airfield, an abandoned airfield in the middle of Cambodia, in this area in Kampong Chhnang, which is just kind of like Las Vegas. There's nothing there, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of all these sugar palms and grazing animals, there's an airfield. And everybody referred to this airfield as the Chinese Airfield. And as we talked to people around there, what they told us is that this was something that was built during the Khmer Rouge era by the Chinese. And this is something that just got me thinking as to why was this built, who built it, how was it built, what does this say about China's relations with the Democratic Kampuchea regime. And it just started a whole kind of spiraling of all sorts of questions and really motivated this project. I'll come back to the airfield in due course. So as I was thinking about this project, we generally know in broad brushstrokes that China was an important, in fact, key ally of the regime of Democratic Kampuchea under Pol Pot from 1975 to the very, very early part of 1979. But we really don't know much beyond that. So what I really wanted to do is get into this a little bit and try to get a sense of what was going on to establish some sort of a systematic understanding of this relationship. And I ended up focusing on Chinese aid to Democratic Kampuchea. And as I was going through the data that I was collecting, I came up with, or I was confronted with this puzzle that when the Khmer Rouge came to power in 1975, on April 17th of that year, it was a country that had been rocked and decimated by civil war, by American B-52 bombing, and it was, even before that, the economy itself, much of the rural economy was literally medieval, and the economic and commercial infrastructure was really quite modest. So this was the definition of a supine, weak country. Yet China, which at that point was already a nuclear power and certainly a regional superpower, was unable to influence the policies undertaken by its client state, that of Democratic Kampuchea. And so this is the puzzle that I wanted to answer in this book. And the answer, not surprisingly for those of you who know my work or have come across it, has to do with, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. For me, I do Chinese bureaucratic politics. If there's any question about China, it's like, well, it's bureaucratic politics. What else could it be? So this is, when I look at China, if you ask me a question about hydropower, this is my answer. If you ask me a question about foreign trade, this is my answer. If you ask me a question about intellectual property, this is my answer. So if you ask me the puzzle about why China was unable to influence Khmer Rouge policy, this is the answer. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack this over the next few minutes. Not surprisingly, my argument is an institutional bureaucratic politics argument, and that is that to understand the variation in outcomes of Chinese foreign aid and assistance and the influence that came with it vis-a-vis Democratic Kampuchea, you have to look not only at the individual bureaucracies on each of the two sides, but also in terms of the dynamic interactions between them. So I look at three bureaucracies, or not three bureaucracies, rather. I look at three cases of foreign aid. One is military aid, the second is infrastructure assistance, and then the third is trade. And what I find is, in the case of military aid, I'm going to go through this very quickly, we had a number of situations where China had some very, very clear priorities in terms of where it wanted certain things built, whether it was the airfield in Kampong Chhnang that I started this talk with, or whether it was radar installations throughout the country. China essentially told Phnom Penh, or Beijing told Phnom Penh what it wanted. Phnom Penh said, thanks very much, we'll take that into consideration, and instead responded by saying, this is what we want, regardless of what you want, are you still going to help us? And China said yes. In the case of the airfields, China wanted the airfield up near the Cambodia-Thai border. The Cambodians wanted it here. One of the reasons why the Chinese didn't want it so close, close to the middle of the country, is because it's actually quite close to Vietnam. And when the Vietnamese invaded in late 1978, they were actually able to fire some ordnance onto the airfield. The airfield was built so well that the Cambodians who were there at the time said that the bombs falling on the airfield was like chickens pecking on the runway. So it was, the Chinese knew how to build airfields. In terms of radar installations, again, the Chinese wanted the radar installations in the southwestern part of the country, facing out towards the Gulf of Thailand. The Cambodians wanted these radar facilities built pretty much all over the country, but particularly along its land borders with Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. Again, the Cambodians got what they wanted. What explains this outcome? To cut to the chase, the argument that I make in the book is that both China and Cambodia had fairly well-run security bureaucracies. In the case of Cambodia, Cambodia didn't do many things terribly well during this period, but one of the things it did very well, as we know from all the literature on it, is they were able to establish and maintain a security state. So the military and civilian security apparatus were one under the direct control of Sun Sen, and essentially this was a bureaucracy that was able to push back China's demands. They had the ear of Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia, who were at the top of the ruling apparatus, and as a result, as I mentioned, China was confronted with either do it our way or don't help us at all. And China decided to do it the Cambodians' way. That's not terribly surprising, and that's the way a lot of things in the foreign aid world work. What's more interesting, or what's more surprising, are these other cases where the outcomes were actually quite different. This just gives you an idea of what the engineering corps of the Chinese military around that time looked like. And to look at it graphically, you have fairly streamlined bureaucracies on both sides, and the result is that the airfields, the radar installations, and other things that the Cambodians wanted, China provided. The place where China held firm and refused to give Phnom Penh what it wanted was to have active Chinese military on the ground in Cambodia. They had plenty of Chinese military advisors, but not actual Chinese fighting units. Okay, the second case that I want to look at is that of infrastructure assistance, and that has to do, and I'm going to focus on the case of the petroleum refinery in Kampong Som in southwestern Cambodia. This is a photograph taken at the time by one of the Chinese technicians involved, and what became so the goal of this project was to retrofit a petroleum facility that had been built by the French in 1968 in order to process crude oil from China. It had been set up to process crude oil from the Middle East, and then it had been run down, and parts of it had been taken away during the Cambodian Civil War. So by 1975, it was really, it needed a facelift. And it also needed to be able to process Chinese crude. Plans for the project began in 1976, and for the next 2 years, it was a comedy of errors. You had all sorts of problems emanating both on the Chinese side and on the Cambodian side. These are all quotes from Chinese workers who were at the site at the time, and these were the complaints that they had. Everything from the fact that they were not getting what they wanted from the various ministries that they were attached to the fact that the Cambodians were sitting there laughing at them, to the fact that they missed their manto. And there were all sorts of other problems associated with being there that I don't have time to get into right now. The problems on the Chinese side were you had very, very poor coordination among the various bureaucracies, everything from mismatched parts to all sorts of turf wars between not only ministries, but the various design institutes that were attached to the ministries. And on the Cambodian side, you had poorly skilled workers. There was one of the engineers, Chinese engineers that I talked to, missed his only opportunity to visit Angkor Wat because he was told that the pilot on his plane was 17 years old. And he decided that maybe I'll give that one a miss. As a result, by 1978, it really became unclear to the Chinese who on the Cambodian side they should even report to. And part of the reason there was you had all sorts of purges that were now targeting the commercial infrastructure and the person in charge, ultimately in charge of this type of a project. So if you look at it graphically, it looks a little bit more like this. So much like the outcome is the same in terms of the military, in terms of influence, as it was in the first case, which is that China didn't end up having much, but the reasons why were quite different. The one place where China was able to exercise influence was in the area of trade. And it was, I don't know why I have a picture of the Mayagas here, which is really not the right, but I just wanted to give a sense of what a container vessel at that time looked like. What was really interesting is that it seems to me that the Cambodian side really didn't think much about trade, that it wasn't a top priority issue. And so there was a little bit of political gray area there, where they could pretty much run with something and not be under the magnifying glass of the top leadership. On the Chinese side, you had a fairly well-run, streamlined bureaucracy that stovepiped a lot of trade issues in ways that allowed for more efficient and effective outcomes, certainly much more so than what would have been the case even 15 years after that. On the Cambodian side, I can talk about, go into excruciating detail, but the bottom line was that Cambodian bureaucracy in terms of domestically distributing and managing goods that were coming in, as well as goods that were prepared for export, was actually a fairly well-run bureaucracy. And as a result, you had all sorts of really strange outcomes. So, first of all, the person at the very, very top was a guy named Vorn Beck, who was one of the original leaders of the Khmer Rouge movement, somebody who was quite close to Pol Pot and who had a fair amount of, he was also the supervisor of Son Sen when it came to issues of security. So he was somebody who was fairly well placed and somebody who had a fair amount of free rein in terms of what he wanted to do. That is until November of 1978 when he was arrested, tortured, and then executed. One of the interesting outcomes was that the Chinese were able to help build an import-export company run by Khmer Rouge cadre based in downtown Hong Kong, in Central. on Devoe Road. It was a company of 4 people that lived together in a communal apartment in Happy Valley. This is a photograph of the lobby. You know, one can only imagine the various types of sitcoms that one can come up with. 3.5 Khmer Rouge, I don't know. And there were even plans of doing something similar in Singapore. In fact, the Khmer Rouge were expanding their trading links not only with China, but also with countries like Japan, France, Singapore, and a number of others through these import-export companies, so that their trading partners would have plausible deniability by saying, well, we don't trade with the Khmer Rouge. Okay, so what are some of the larger conceptual implications of this? If there's one takeaway from this talk that I'd like people to have, is that we often think about Chinese domestic politics as being highly fragmented. Certainly, the people who trained me as a scholar of Chinese politics, the sum of their life's work underscores the fact that Chinese bureaucracies, Chinese institutions are badly fragmented, and that policy outputs rarely resemble the initial thoughts, goals, and interests of the people that began the policy process. Yet, when we think about, not domestic politics, but when we think about international politics or China's international behavior, we tend to think of China as being elite-driven, top-down, and largely monolithic. And in fact, there is a disconnect there. Why, and this is a rhetorical why do we do that? In fact, we're looking at the same exact bureaucracies when we're looking at the implementation of policy, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy in China. And so that's if there's a larger lesson in this book, it is this. Okay. And ultimately, I think the other takeaway is that if we want to think about China's international behavior, probably the way to think about it is that China's ability to influence its international partners is really only as good as the institutions that manage that relationship. Okay. How am I doing on time?
We're doing quite well.
Okay, great.
Okay, 10, 15 minutes.
Excellent.
10 more minutes or so.
Perfect. Okay, great. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit, so that's the basic argument. And if it seemed really quick, and if you'd like to delve into it in more detail, I'd be more than happy to talk about during the Q&A. And there are plenty of copies of the book over there, which I might add would make wonderful Mother's Day. But what I want to do now is really talk about how this idea came about, because people don't usually do that. And I thought that this particular research project had a number of dead ends and false starts and difficulties that I hadn't confronted before, and it's something that I like to talk about, to at least give people some sense of hope that if you set your mind to something, you might be able to reach it, even though it looks pretty dicey at times. So I first got interested in, like I said, in March of 2010 when I visited the airfield in Kampong Chinam called the Chinese Airfield. While we were there, we did all sorts of things. First of all, we negotiated with the general who was in charge of that area, and we asked him if we could go to the airfield, if we could go visit various parts of the infrastructure, and he said, yeah, sure, that's fine, just remember me on your way out. So we asked, so how much does remembering him cost? About $20. So as long as we paid him the $20, we could pretty much do whatever we wanted. So it's a 2-kilometer long airstrip, so we floored the car going in this direction and that direction. It was the kind of things that we...
So you still have more power?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was wondering if you were saying, oh, time's up. Okay. One of the things that we did when we were there is we actually went under one of the mountains that was there, and went about half to 3/4 of a kilometer in, and we saw this big, this actually massive complex of offices that were built by the Chinese in service of this airfield. It was unfinished, But it was pretty extraordinary, and this was something that Cambodian technology was completely unable to do for no other reason that Cambodian engineers had pretty much been all killed at the early parts of the revolution. So this is really quite extraordinary. There's any number of, we saw maybe a dozen huge rooms, and they were being fitted for electricity and plumbing and things like that. So this is really something that was quite extraordinary, and it was something. The only reason we were able to go there is because we knew it existed. It was completely camouflaged from. So that got me interested in the project initially. Unfortunately, 2 months before that, in January of 2010, the Chinese ambassador to Cambodia, Madam Zhang Jinfeng, who's over here, said that denied that China had any influence at all and had anything to do with the domestic politics of democratic Kampuchea, which unfortunately made it very difficult for me to do research in China, because it was very difficult for me to go and say, I know that you didn't do this, but can you give me some data on what you didn't do? So it was, as a result, I had to go do things kind of from the back door, so to speak. Not so much in China, but in Cambodia. So one of the things I was able to do is I worked at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia for a few months. In both while I was in Ithaca, and I also spent a couple weeks in Cambodia. This is the War Crimes Tribunal that's still ongoing, and I was able to get quite a bit of information, a lot of data while I was there. Unfortunately, I can only use the smallest fraction of it because it is still it's trying to think of, I can think of all the Chinese classifications. I'm trying to think of it in English. It's
embargoed because the trial is
it's
ongoing.
embargoed. So this is not. I cannot use this data, unfortunately, but it's there, and it'll tell an extraordinary story when it is out. But at least it got me thinking in terms of, and it allowed me to access things that would help me move forward. One of the other things, and this is the really important thing that happened, is I stumbled across a set of folders. Each folder is about this thick, full of Chinese documents at the National Archives in Phnom Penh. These are all from this period. They're blueprints for infrastructure projects, for military projects, for this blueprints for the Kangdong Song refinery, as well as bills of lading and other trading documents. So, and there's 3 dozen or so of these. And so this was really a huge step forward. The problem was, and of course, the fact that they were all top secret made it really exciting for me as a researcher. Unfortunately, these documents were so technical that initially I thought, wow, my Chinese really has gotten lousy because I can't really make sense of these. Then I had some friends of mine who were native speakers take a look at it. Couldn't make sense of them either. I had some Chinese engineers look at them. They couldn't either. This was so specialized that I was really kind of at a loss. So I had all this really, really great material, but I didn't know what to do with it. What do I do? So I was going to show a picture of the Great Wall and say I hit a wall, but that would have been too. So I had made a few trips to China, seeking out friends and colleagues who I knew who were engineers who might be able to help me. None of them really knew what to say. So finally, I was sitting in my office, and I had one of my undergraduates come to my office hours, and she was talking about a paper that she had to write, and she was having a hard time finding data. And I responded to her by saying, "You're having a hard time finding data? Let me tell you what it's like to not have data." And so we just started commiserating. And so we're talking for about 10, 15 minutes, and I saw a light bulb go off above her head. She said, one of my grandparents was in the petroleum bureaucracy in China around that time. You want me to give them a call? And I said, yeah, sure, whatever, knock yourself out, Turns out, this grandparent was in the petroleum bureaucracy at the time, was quite popular, knew a whole bunch of people, including some of the technicians who were in Cambodia during that time. So that was really a coup. And in fact, some are in this photograph. I'm not going to tell you which ones because they are anonymous. I'll give you a hint. It is not Hu Yaobang. It is not Wang Dongxing. It is not Yu Qiuyi. But somebody else in this photograph, or some other people in this photograph. These people were, so we arranged to, this undergraduate and I went to China, arranged to meet with these folks, spent 2 weeks interviewing them, debriefing them. And the really wonderful thing was, these are like old people anywhere. They have all these great stories, nobody wants to listen to them. And there we were saying, please tell us everything. And so they were, they were delighted, and we just had, it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. Really, some really amazing people. Not only did they shared photographs with us, they also shared their diaries at the time with us. So all of a sudden we were able to animate, and then we were able to see some of their names on these blueprints, so we knew that we had really come full circle. Finally, and I think the right response to this photograph is, wow, you've lost weight since then. But one of the things that I was able to do was find people in Cambodia who were willing to talk about this time. And this is the former party secretary of the Democratic Kampuchean Embassy in Beijing during that time. And initially I thought that there was no way that she would want to talk to me because this is, and she's on the record, so it's not like she's very outspoken about her experiences. But originally I sent my research assistant to go talk to her because I knew that she wouldn't want to, this would be too sensitive for her to want to talk to me. He came back a few minutes later saying, actually no, she wants to talk to you. I was like, why? She hasn't spoken Chinese in 15 years. She's dying to speak Chinese. So I went there, and as you can see, we hit it off pretty well. This was followed by a lunch, by the way, where she was telling me how the current leader of Cambodia, Hun Sen, really doesn't understand the democratic process. While under the same breath, she'd talk about how wonderful Pol Pot was, how great sense of humor he had, and she's his former cook, by the way, which gives you an idea of kind of what it takes to get through the civil service to become the party secretary of the Democratic Kampuchean Embassy in Beijing. And her husband, by the way, was the ambassador, and she would refer to him by, there was an urn at the top of a shelf while we were interviewing in her house, and she's like, yes, there he is, he's listening to us. So anyway, it was a really surreal experience, but she was able to give all sorts of really, really amazing detail, and one of the things that she underscored was that the Chinese were not at all happy with Pol Pot. Particularly Deng Xiaoping was very, very outspoken. But when I asked her what Pol Pot's reaction was, she said, he'd basically repeat what the Chinese said and then not say anything, which we all knew to mean that we don't really need to care about what the Chinese think. And most of I didn't interview this person, this was somebody, I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the atmospherics of where these interviews took place in Cambodia. It was usually in people's houses, which usually looked like this, although they tended to be a bit dirtier. Okay, finally, just in terms of time, what I'd like to do is just finish up with the policy relevance of all of this. When we look at China's foreign aid abroad, when we look at Chinese foreign aid today, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that maybe we should worry a bit more than we are, because China's influence with these other countries, particularly in the developing world, is likely to grow and come into conflict with, say, the United States influence, and that maybe those are the fault lines by which we're likely to see tension occurring in the near future. My sense from this research is that this conventional wisdom that we think about in terms of China's growing international influence is actually not as compelling an argument as I might have thought at the beginning of this research. My sense, as I said before, is that to understand the efficacy of China's interactions with these other countries and its ability to manage these relationships, we really have to focus on kind of the subnational or the sub kind of elite governing and government institutions of China, many of which were built in the 1950s and simply are not built and are not calibrated to handle the types of challenges that China faces today. As a result, these institutions tend to be far more fragmented than we might think them to be. And for those of us who study Chinese domestic politics, I think one of the things that we can do to share with our colleagues who look at China's international relations is to put forward this notion that Chinese bureaucracies are the ones that manage China's domestic politics are oftentimes the very same ones that handle the implementation of Chinese foreign policy, particularly when we're looking at China's extending its influence abroad. One of the other interesting things that came about during this research is that the time period of democratic Kampuchea was a really unique time in Chinese history as well. So when the Khmer Rouge took over on January 17, 1975, Mao was still alive, the leftists were still ascendant, and Deng Xiaoping was a few months away from being purged a second time. By the time the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and took over Phnom Penh in early January, China had just completed its third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, and Deng was, if not already on U.S. soil, close to it. The reformers had triumphed, so you really have kind of the gamut of the Chinese political spectrum on display during this time period. Yet policy towards democratic Kampuchea was remarkably stable and constant during that time. And finally, some might say, well, Chinese institutions were fragmented back then. Are they really as fragmented today as they were back then? And my argument would be, if anything, they're even more so today. So I think that one always has to be very careful about the generalizations that they make, particularly if they're based on kind of a bilateral relationship and experience that occurred almost 4 decades ago. Nonetheless, I think there are some lessons here if we take them with sufficient care to understanding how China manages its bilateral relations today. And let me close with that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Whenever I see those pictures, I always think of Andy as the Indiana Jones of the political science field, going out to these airfields in the middle of Cambodia, and things like that.
I remember you and I poring over those pictures in Hong Kong
Right.
when fresh off the.
So I want to just reframe a question that I've asked you previously. One of the main points of your book is that China got precious little in return for their aid, and it seemed to me that what China said at the time and says now is our aid comes with no strings attached. We don't interfere with your domestic politics, or a few strings attached, and we don't interfere with your domestic politics. So I could see our Chinese friends saying, well, we didn't get much in return because we don't seek to do that. So how would your book respond to that?
Well, hopefully
That point.
I'll respond to your question better than I did at the podcast, because I've had some time to think about it
Okay.
now. I think there's a lot there. I mean, Chinese aid ostensibly comes with no strings attached. There are always strings. But I think one of the ways to maybe think about it is the way in which, to use kind of the Chinese notion of guanxi as a metaphor. And this is something that guanxi, and this is, I'll explain it the way I explain it to my undergraduates, because it's still, I think, the best way for me to understand this idea of relationships. I assume most people here have seen the first Godfather movie. So the first scene of the first scene of the first Godfather movie, somebody comes up to the Don and asks him for a favor, saying, "Look, I won't go into the details." And the Don thinks about it, plays around with him like a cat plays with a mouse before he kills him, and thinks, okay, I'll help you. But in exchange, there might come a time, and this day might never come, when I might ask you for a favor back. And I tell my undergraduates, this is guanxi. Except in China, nobody would ever be so gauche as to actually articulate this. This is all understood. Maybe that's one way to conceptualize that, this idea of there are no strings attached now, we're not really thinking about it now, but who knows what might happen, in the future. Maybe this is a way to think about it in terms of kind of a contract being the beginning of a relationship rather than the culmination of one. I think there's a book that's been written about the bilateral relationship between China and Cambodia by Sophie Richardson, Columbia University Press, called China, Cambodia, and the Five Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. And her argument is that this relationship really was cradled within these five principles. So it's more of a normative or an ideational argument that I might feel comfortable with. But it's consistent with this idea, and it's an excellent book. And I think she doesn't look at the same period I do because she didn't have the same type of data she had for other periods of the relationship between the two countries. But I think the Khmer Rouge period fits in probably better into kind of her overarching argument than some of the more recent ones do. So, that's how I might answer that question. The question is, as usual, better than the answer.
Well, let me open it to yes. And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, please.
Bill Armbrust, a retired journalist. What implications does your research into this subject have for China's ability to influence North Korea?
North Korea is a bit of a special case. I think in a more general sense, and this will come to, let me start broadly and kind of work my way in. One of the things that I worry about, and I worry about even more so having done this research, is it's not simply a question of China's influence, it's also China's ability to manage a crisis. My sense is everything is going to look pretty good for China for quite a period of time until there's a crisis. And then I'm really unclear as to whether or not it will be able to manage one particularly well. And it might be akin to the way in which China had to manage the crisis of the Vietnamese invasion of democratic Kampuchea, which was not, it came as a complete surprise to the people who were on the ground in China. They were negotiating with the Cambodians over the next 5 years of trade 2 days before the Vietnamese entered Phnom Penh. So they were,
which was when exactly? End of '78.
That would have been December of I think the negotiations were on December 22nd of 1978. So 3 days before they invaded Cambodia, not entered Phnom Penh. But so at least for the people on the ground, there was really no. But to the question of North Korea, I think the thing that's particularly problematic there is we're under the impression, or we're under the assumption that China can really force Pyongyang to do things that Pyongyang is not willing to do, and that China is somehow not being as forceful as it would like to be or as it should, that maybe it's holding something back for some reason. My sense is it is holding something back, and the reason why is it doesn't want to push North Korea too much, because if the regime in North Korea implodes, that means 10 million North Koreans streaming into China. I was just talking with a colleague, Kevin O'Brien, who's at the 38th parallel, and he was saying all sorts of kind of amazing stories that were there. So between the two Koreas, I mean, you have things like ecosystems that don't exist anywhere else in the world because no one's been there for 50 years, 60 years. So it's, whereas I remember when I was at Dandong on the North Korean border with China, I was with some Chinese guests, and they took us on a boat, and we were about as far from the North Korean border as I am from Jan. And it was a kind of very awkward situation where you had these listless North Koreans kind of looking at us like that, and the Chinese pointing at them and saying, look at how poor they are, and look at how much better off we are. And I was just hoping they didn't speak Chinese. But it was really something where, you know, if the river freezes over, you know, there's the barriers to entering China are all within North Korea, not within China. And if you have an invasion like that, that's it's doing better now, but it's the Rust Belt of China. So it's really not it's a place where 15 years ago you had some cities that had upwards of 30% unemployment. So it's really a doomsday scenario for people in Beijing to think about the implosion of North Korea. And so I think they're playing it very, very safe, and they don't want to rock the boat, because they're likely the ones who are going to fare, if not the worst, the second worst.
Leah?
You had a map at the end that showed recent numbers with China's foreign aid in other parts of the world, and I was just curious as to whether or not, I mean, you're saying that there are certain implications for the way Chinese bureaucracies work that might be applicable today, but do you have any sense of comparison, any case studies, or are you thinking about looking in that direction? That's one question. The second one is just whether or not you did any research through the Cold War International History Project archives on the period you were researching.
So let me take this, the second part first. I looked at China's relations with Vietnam and with Albania during this time frame. Because these were two, you know, Vietnam for reasons of proximity, and Albania because it was one of China's larger and more strategic allies, which gives you an idea of how isolated China was with Albania. So, but one of the interesting things was with Cambodia, you really had the full package. So I mean, you didn't just have an outlet for Chinese engineers and skilled workers to go and ply their wares and build things like you know, the Uhuru Railway in Tanzania, for example. I mean, this was something that really it was something that was crafted and calibrated for, you know, the needs of Cambodia. In a sense, Cambodia was, at that time, was unique in that China had sought for more than a decade to be a rallying point for the developing world, and had not been successful. So this was really essentially it fell into Beijing's lap. In terms of the larger question of implications, I mean, I don't want to. I want to be very careful. I'm not. There are people who are China scholars who are much better prognosticators than I am. I'm on record as saying in 1997 that watch out, Chao Shi is the man to really, watch. He's going to be powerful. He's going to do great things. And he was pretty much purged a few months later. subsequently, my colleague Alan Carlson asked me, so what do you think, when the whole Bolshoi thing began? What do you think? Is this big? And my response was, flash in the pan. These things happen all the time. It's just, people get, chattering on the interwebs. So I mean, I just completely missed the. So I want to be very, very careful in terms of, what I'm predicting, or suggesting. What I am saying is that this is consistent with what other people like David Shambar are saying. This whole notion of China spreading itself quite wide, but not terribly deep, and that lack of depth might influence kind of how things move forward and how China is likely to react, again, in a crisis. I'm throwing another log on the fire by saying that to understand the actual types of dynamics, as well as to maybe look at some of the variation that across projects, across time periods, that one place we may want to look is the bureaucracy. And in fact, I'll just, one last thing I'll say there is, one of the interesting, I just read a paper by Barry Naughton, where he was arguing that under the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao administration, you actually saw some institutionalization of economic policy within the government as distinct from the party. And as a result of that institutionalization, which everybody saw as being a good thing, as a result you saw a downturn in terms of the rate of economic development, an increase in corruption and rent seeking. And so one of the things that Xi Jinping is doing now is he's introduced this deepening of reform leadership small group, which is a party small group that has no people with strong economic backgrounds among its top 23 members. It's a 43-member leadership small group, so it's not terribly small. Yet, one of the things, but it's the key. He wants it to be the key decision-making body for economic decision-making. So, if anything, we're seeing even more fragmentation and superimposition of new institutions onto old ones. There are people who I cite in the book who have worked on China's energy bureaucracies today, and the picture that they paint makes the energy bureaucracy, which was never terribly coherent, something that seems to me to be almost impossible to navigate these days. So I think there's the assumption that you have to carry to really animate this beyond this one case and take it to different places in space and time, is that you have similar degrees of, or comparable degrees of fragmentation within China's institutions that manage this project, manage these relationships. And my sense is that it's still very much the case. I don't know if that answers.
Frank Tail, United States China Exchanges. This may go beyond where you are, but let me raise it anyway. Have you had any opportunity to make any comparisons between what you talked about today and USAID in Cambodia now, or USAID in Vietnam at that period, just up until 75, or USAID in Laos and Thailand? In other words, are we talking about a unique Chinese-Cambodian relationship, or are we talking about a global institutional relationship between an aid giver, big nation, and an aid receiver, small nation?
Or can I just broaden that a little bit?
Yeah.
Also, comparable between China, Cambodia aid giving then and now.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the China and Cambodia then and now, there are a lot of similarities. You have this, China still undertakes all of this under this larger rubric of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, this lack of, this non-conditionality. It's also, it's similar then as and now in that the types of projects that China is willing to undertake largely are the ones that Cambodia wants and insists on. Now that would seem self-evident, except one of the things that I find certainly in Cambodia today is that there are certain things that the U.S. is willing to fund, and there's a whole bunch of other things that it is not willing to fund. So there's in addition to this idea of conditionality, there's also various things that donor countries are institutionally geared towards setting up, and those that they are not. Beyond that, I think there's a strategic element to all of this, which I didn't really talk about much during the talk, and in terms of China's relationship with Cambodia then, obviously the 600-pound gorilla in the room then was Vietnam. Now it seems to be whatever China's interests in the region are. Cambodia is China's best friend in the region, in that its recent interactions with the Philippines have been quite negative. China is on the wrong side of history as far as a number of ASEAN members aver, yet Cambodia is squarely in China's corner, and that's something that I think underscores the importance of that particular bilateral relationship, and makes it, adds or contributes to this idea that it was important then for geostrategic reasons. It remains so today for geostrategic reasons as well. One of the things that's different in China today versus during the time period that I'm talking about, and also which is different from, say, the U.S. aid relationship, is that China also is involved in all sorts of extractive operations as well, for minerals, timber, and Cambodia is one of the places where China is able to engage largely kind of unconstrained in real estate and in textile production. And it was China, that's a different dimension from China during the time frame that I talk about in the book, where the manufacturing that went on, largely Cambodian exports to China were mostly kind of exotic forest goods. The only kind of really strategically important commodity was natural rubber. I know less about the U.S. AID relationship, but it does in kind of in my limited experience, it really tends to be focused on a couple key areas, whether it's human rights, whether it's things like HIV prevention. There are a couple. There's always 3 or 4 major focal points, and if it falls outside of those, there's generally less of an opportunity, or there's the aid doesn't exist, for those other types of projects, those other types of relationships. Whereas in China, my sense is it's more a question of what do you need. If that answers your question.
We have time for one more brief question. Yes?
The question would be,
Roxanne.
Roxanne Woodkin. I'm wondering whether you could say who in the Chinese so-called bureaucracy in the mid-70s was advocating agreeable relations with Cambodia.
So who was?
Yes, who was favoring that? I believe you implied that it was a general group.
Mm-hmm.
And it may have been a sort of general nonsense at the time, supporting our brothers abroad.
Right.
And I wonder now whether the impetus for trade, or the impetus for expansion, is to acquire more, not only minerals, but land on which to grow things, to serve China's exploding population or exploded population. Because you see the Chinese coming to this country and buying a whole lot of stuff, including real estate, a whole lot of stuff. They moved into Africa, they moved into Latin America, and they're bringing a lot of natural resources from those countries to their own. And it seems to me it's pretty one-sided in terms of interest, or I'm missing something. So those are my two tiny questions.
Well,
And Andy, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to ask you to keep the answer.
even tinier. Okay, well, let me take the second one first. So my sense is it fits a larger pattern. Cambodia is a small country, so there's only so much that you can do, but it certainly fits within that pattern. In fact, there was just a huge sale of Cambodian land that was, I forget the exact dimensions, but something really quite extraordinary to be built on and developed. It is a one-sided relationship. The person, or the only person in Cambodia that really seems, or the only stratum in Cambodia that really seems to be benefiting from this are elites, and particularly Hun Sen. So these are two regimes that really kind of know how to work with one another. I mean, they understand each other, I think, implicitly. I think that's part of it. In terms of the first question, if I can just briefly answer, because it's such a great question, and you had a number of different people within the Chinese government and party at that time who were pursuing the relationship for any number of different reasons. So you had a number of the leftists who saw themselves being in decline in early 1970, or early 1977, late 1976, making pilgrimages to Cambodia to kind of shore up their support back home, to say, look, they're even more radical than we are, and it's working. Maybe, in that, we all know what happened there, but it was really something that, I'm spacing on his name right now. The Dajai, wasn't Jidong, Chen Yong-wei spent 6 weeks in democratic Kampuchea, not just spending time with elites, but really visiting as many model communes as he could. There were others as well. Then you had others who were pragmatists, who just saw the eroding relationship with Vietnam, and they decided that we need to have a counterweight, even though Vietnam is Vietnam and Cambodia is Cambodia, it's better than nothing. So there were, I actually do speak about that at some length at the beginning of the book, because it's really important. I think it's really important for political scientists anyway to understand the various different levels of analysis and the types of interests that a top leader might have versus a minister of a bureaucracy might have, versus workers within that bureaucracy, versus people in the foreign policy elite, why they might pursue that relationship, and whether or not, even if they have different reasons for doing so, would they, on a simple yes or no dimension, even though they would pretty much agree that this is a relationship that should be pursued, there are all sorts of different reasons why they might come to that conclusion. So absolutely.
Andy, that was a fascinating talk, and thank you all for coming and participating in a great discussion. Thank you again, of course, to our friends at the Luce Foundation, and we do have books for sale at the table in that corner of the room for anyone who is interested in learning more about Andy's research. Thank you all for coming.